And we had a
Yeah.
really open and frank conversation. And I explained to him how that made me feel. And I think the optics of how that whole situation unfolded really made me feel. And
Yeah.
it was a really eye opening experience for me because after that time, I
Mhm.
gained so much respect from him and our working
Mm.
relationship just improved immensely. And so I
Yeah.
obviously never asked to do that again.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Envisionnaire Podcast with Nicole Ningyuan. This is a podcast where we explore everyday topics, share our experiences, and help turn life's challenges into life's opportunities. Let's get ready to envision living our best lives. On today's episode, we have Trang Phan, who will be discussing the topic of establishing our boundaries while also maintaining empathy. I have known Trang for over a decade, nearly 13 years, and she is one of my all-time best friends and soul sister who I admire greatly. Trang and I met while we worked in politics together and have gone through so much. Trang is a smart, kind, generous, and loving person, and the sort of best friend every girl should have. One of the qualities I greatly admire is her ability to set boundaries very clearly, but also maintain empathy and kindness towards others. So I am so happy that she agreed to join us for this episode of the Envisionnaire Podcast. Welcome, Trang.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you so much for having me. Excited
No
to be here.
problem. I'm so happy to have you on talking about boundaries, which is an area that I have struggled with throughout my whole life, probably because I have a tendency to be a real people pleaser. Throughout our friendship, because obviously we met, we were in our early 20s. And so I feel like, obviously looking at you and how we've grown and so on, one of the things that remained always true with you was your sense of self-worth, your confidence, and this kind of ability to make sure that you weren't mistreated or taken advantage of. So I would love to talk to you a little bit about that today. And maybe we can first start with who Trang is, your family dynamics, because you have a very, very interesting family background.
So I'm from Ottawa, the capital city of Canada. I was born and raised here by two Vietnamese refugees. So
Yeah.
that's been a big part of my life and experiences and a lot of the principles and values, the things that I've gained from my parents. And I'm an only child, and my upbringing, we were in a more suburban area in Ottawa. I was one of the few Asian looking students, although I never really noticed it throughout my life until probably later in life. I think I was pretty shy and obedient growing up. I think a lot of my self-identity started to form more so, I would say, like in junior high when I started, making different friendships and learning about other experiences and cultures, and then just really probably identifying myself more so in high school when I had to kind of assert myself in terms of my own independence. Because even though my parents weren't very strict, they did have standards for me and certain traditions that I just didn't always sit with me. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's very common for first generation Canadians. But I think it's amazing because obviously I've known your family for quite a while, and I always really respected the way, your parents they worked so hard. They're very, very proud of you and your accomplishes. And I think they really integrated into the Canadian culture wholeheartedly. So I'm sure they were very much aware of the fact that you would obviously also probably have some different views as you grew up. Maybe not the similar sort of views that maybe they had when they were your age. Different times.
Yeah, in terms of like integrating, it's funny you say that because during my upbringing, I think more so in my earlier years before high school, I would say, I had a period of shame, actually, like actual shame in terms of, just being Vietnamese, just being different.
Yeah.
And so, and even in terms of like socioeconomic background, my parents weren't we weren't like well off. They came here with nothing, and my dad
Yeah.
pursued his education and,
Yeah.
did his master's degree, like first in his family and ended up, working on Parliament Hill. He ended up, working really hard and had
Mm.
a very, I think, rich life, but, he was frugal in many ways. And I think
Mhm.
entering the public school system and the high school that I ended up going, I think it was more of an upper middle class,
Mhm.
demographic, and then
Mhm.
I started to feel different because, some of my traditions were different. Like I had to teach my parents about Santa Claus. Like they didn't know those kinds of things.
Right, right,
Um,
right, right.
I
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
remember feeling like we had a Toyota Tercel and other people had like, more luxurious cars where they're getting dropped off. And I would tell my parents to actually drop me off somewhere.
Oh.
And looking back now, I feel so terrible, right? And I'm just like,
Aw,
they were so
no.
practical, and just, but it's funny how you kind of, even as a younger child, I had felt that, and in my mind, I
Mm.
thought, I had to look a certain way, right? Have the blonde hair and blue eyes.
Mm, mhm,
Um,
mhm, mhm. Yeah,
and I think that was just about understanding how I fit in. And rather
yeah.
than trying to be like everybody else, I think there was a period of time where I realized, you know what, I need to just accept who I am. But that kind of came with,
Mm.
later on in life, right? Because I think in high school, everyone has insecurities. And I suppose that was probably one area of insecurity
Yeah.
I had.
That's very interesting. Okay, wait. Well, so let's go because I think the high school bit and that kind of transformative period where you felt like you just accepted yourself. I think that's really key to this whole discussion entirely about boundaries and knowing your self-worth. But before that, in school, how were you in school, elementary school?
Yeah, I remember being in kindergarten and I had a teacher and I was already identified as a gifted child or at least like enriched
Wow.
or whatnot. So I
That's
think,
amazing.
but then going through elementary school, I don't think we even had those classifications in school, but even in high school, like I was in the enriched program. So I think
Oh.
I think I had a good sense of work ethic. I knew that, I had to be disciplined and, work to get like good grades. So there was always, that self motivation to do that. And I suppose, I guess, just having those early years, but then there were time periods in school where, in high school in particular, like that's where I was really trying to understand myself more and actually really reassert my independence from my parents. Cause I found that, simple things like they wouldn't let me go for sleepovers. And I thought that was
Mm.
like, it really bothered me because then it actually hindered my ability to make closer, meaningful friendships, right? Because I would lose out on those opportunities. So there
Mhm.
was periods where I actually, had to run away just to kind of differentiate and just also oppose some of the things that I just didn't necessarily agree with.
Mhm.
Particularly from my mother, I think, more
Mm.
so because she had a more very fearful, cautious approach to life. And I think that probably stems from a lot of her trauma from leaving Vietnam, like on her own at
Yeah.
a young age. So
Yeah.
it's not necessarily a criticism. But I was
Yeah.
lucky in the sense that even though my dad, he was all about learning, education, independence, he was strongly instilled that value in me.
Mm.
And I would say like it's funny because I don't even realize it now, but he was such a strong feminist. And it's
Mm.
really nice to have that and not realizing it like throughout my whole life, but now seeing that shape out.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was always about me being, be financially independent, like don't rely on anything. But it's not that he's saying don't have these meaningful relationships, but even then, like there were things that I just didn't necessarily always agree with and making those, decisions to actually run away was almost a way to, which is probably not the best thing to do, but in a way, I did it safely. It wasn't like I was doing bad
No.
teenage
Yeah.
things, but it was more to say like, I can do things on my own. Like I have my own autonomy, like let me and trust that I will make the right decisions for myself. And it took a few years for us to overcome that. Like my dad didn't actually speak to me for years, like silence, and that's
Oh,
horrible, like just getting the silent
yeah.
treatment. But over time I proved myself and we were able to rebuild our relationship.
But how
But yeah,
old were you when you actually
uh,
asserted yourself?
I would say starting probably around 15, 16.
Wow. Were
Yeah.
you motivated by something like did you see it on TV or did you read something? Did you read a book? Was there any external factors? Or was it just you being like, I'm gonna
Yeah, I
take
think I
this?
was just tired of it, and and I probably didn't effectively communicate as well as I could with my parents, but it was more of a clash in terms of understanding where it's coming from. And just I'm trying to balance their ways of living versus, the Canadian way of living that I was
Yeah.
exposed to just through my education and just through the friendships that I had gained.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I also
Wow.
started like working on my own at a very young age. I mean, I took babysitting jobs like even when I was 11, but I remember
Hmm.
having like a first job when I was about 13, and there was that element of satisfaction about being able to earn your own wage and
Yeah.
have that money that you can use for yourself. So that was
That's
key and gave
interesting.
me that just kind of that space, because at least they were okay with me kind of working for myself, and through that I actually gained a lot of very valuable lessons along the way.
But I think from what I'm hearing, it's this idea of this kind of independence. And maybe that was fostered. Like you said, your dad really taught you that value of being able to be self reliant and kind of self assured. And that gave you that kind of confidence in your abilities in a way. Teenager.
Definitely not something that I would definitely recommend or suggest or advise. I
No.
don't think that is the most effective way. It just happened to work in my way, but like it caused a lot of pain for my
Yeah.
parents, and I wouldn't want to ever, looking back, I feel terrible, and I know that it really hurt them, but I'm glad that I was able to have that opportunity to demonstrate to them, it wasn't really necessarily their fault, but it was really important for me for them to kind of understand that I am just an autonomous person. I have
Hmm.
values, I have good judgment, so.
Hmm. Hmm. Now we're getting into this idea of like transitioning from high school into young adult and the workplace and establishing your boundaries. I'm starting to see, which is really interesting because I'm hearing your stories. Thanks for sharing all this, the background. I'm starting to see now, and I understand why you have this really self-assured demeanor and confidence in yourself. So one of the things, so now this is a very funny anecdote that you told me years ago, and I have told you this, and we laugh about this because you think it's funny that I constantly go back to this anecdote and I share it with people that you've never even met. But I think it's the best anecdote ever. And it's about how when you first started working and you were probably 18, this for me embodies this idea of establishing your boundaries while also being empathetic slash also professional. Do you want to share that story that I know we've talked about before about your experience working in retail? Why don't you
Yeah,
share?
okay. Yeah. So yes, when I was about 17 or 18, I had worked part-time while I was still either in high school, and I think, crossing over to when I did my post-secondary education, that I worked at a retail store. It was a high-end clothing store, tailored for male clientele. And it was also a very male-dominated retail store. It's funny because I definitely picked that job because I thought, what, it's good in terms of learning customer service. And I thought, exposure to interesting people too, going into the store. Interestingly enough, there was one occasion, and I guess this is the story or the anecdote that Nicole is referring to, is just towards the end of the night, everyone has to clean up. And the store manager at the time, we hadn't really known each other. He was new in his role, and he had asked me to clean this corner area. So it was under a clothing display, specifically underneath the actual display, which would require me to actually kneel down and clean. And I felt, really uncomfortable. Firstly, that was not part of my job description. Like at the
Yeah.
time, I was
Yeah.
mainly just dealing with customer transactions just at the till to actually close the deal. And, this was the first time I'd ever been asked that, and I really didn't feel comfortable. And I think I wasn't wearing, clothes like conducive to doing something like that either. So I actually declined. And I was like, no, I don't think I should be doing this, which caused, a reaction like, why? And then I definitely was very firm in just my mind. I'm like, I'm not going to do this. Like nobody else has.
Yeah.
Why should I? Right. And in fact, I'm sure we have cleaning staff as well to do that. It's not like the point about not being like a team
Yeah.
player.
Yeah.
It was such a unusual request. And there were so
Mm.
many other people there that why would you ask me? And this is the first time ever learning that I would have to be responsible for this. It was a bit of a heated exchange. And
Yes.
obviously I was uncomfortable saying that, but I was firmly, this isn't worth it to me. I'm not going to, if this is going to start being my job, this is not what, I signed up for. Later, actually, I can't remember if it was exactly the same day or the next day, but we ended up having a conversation outside of the store. It was actually just in the parking lot of the actual mall, because the store is actually situated in a mall. And we had a really open and frank conversation. And I explained to him how that made me feel. And I think the optics of how that whole situation unfolded really made me feel. And it was a really eye-opening experience for me, because after that time, I gained so much respect from him, and our working relationship just improved like immensely. And so I'd obviously never asked to do that again.
That's incredible.
So that
I think that's incredible. Come on. Like that's,
Yeah.
now that you're thinking about it back, I mean, that is pretty courageous, I think, as a young woman in your first job, just actually take that stance and also just be so kind of like this element of your own self-worth and integrity. That's what it speaks to. I admire that so much, because honest, at that age, I would have been like, sure, how far can you just like move this and I'll go. And so I think it's really impressive, genuinely, that you not only took a stance at that moment, but also after just asserted yourself. And again, I'm sure it would have been in a very respectful manner, and you gained his respect. Good for you, Trang.
Yeah, it's funny because now, I'm older and like further in, my career profession, maybe the approach would the essence of it the same, but if I really felt uncomfortable about a situation, maybe I would just start with a question rather than an outright no. What's really helpful from that experience is that it resulted in a favorable outcome, kind of clarified the situation, because he might just thought like, oh, am I just being insubordinate? That wasn't really what it is. Like, I am a team player totally.
Yeah.
Right? But within reason. And this is what, you need to kind of set the expectation. So when you're going outside of what is expected, then, I'm going to question it, right?
Yeah.
And not necessarily agree to it. And so I think that was an important kind of just learning for myself to kind of continue on to apply. If something doesn't feel right, then, having that instinct to just, you don't always have to aggressively like resist it and shut it down or be insulting, but at the very least, just question.
I love that anecdote. And I hope that helps someone in a similar situation to, if you feel uncomfortable, you feel like some sense of being demeaned in any way, again, like you don't have to be aggressive, but maybe there's a way of dealing with this where you speak up and say no. And so I guess that's a really good segue into the next segment. If you could provide some advice for people looking to establish boundaries. Let's say, why don't we break it down into both the workplace and then also in their personal lives?
Okay. Well, I guess in the workplace, depending on what type of industry you're working with, it might not always be the same kind of advice, but for establishing certain boundaries, and I guess it depends on like what you value in terms of your work, but if it's time and, work-life balance and you want to have some kind of boundary there, it's just making sure that you understand, what you're getting into, and also setting that out up front early on, and hopefully having that agreement, and also applying certain types of tools in place to be able to establish that as well. But for me, I think it's really understanding what you want and then setting that expectation and having a dialogue, and don't always just assume. I think, some people come in very, entitled and demanding of things, but sometimes it needs a proper conversation, but you need to set it out and explain yourself and make a case for yourself, and then hopefully, find different options, and don't just come in demanding without offering something, right? If you want to not have to work after a certain period of hour, then you have to communicate that, right? And offer something else.
So you're saying, okay, let's use a practical example. So you have like a boss who has just like dumped a whole bunch of work on your plate, and it's 5 p.m. on a Friday, and you could work your Friday evening, but you weren't really expecting to. And let's say maybe you have plans for dinner with your friends in a couple of hours, but you know that if you take the work on, you won't be able to see your friends. How would someone in that situation, where obviously there's an authority, there's this like, I could do it, this is not something that's impossible, but it's at your own detriment. How would you deal with that situation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Okay, well, first, in my latter years, in terms of my profession, I've been working in more of a quasi-government setting. So I think there are already just some institutional boundaries in place. But like in that
Yes.
context, I'm a hard worker, and I also
Yeah.
I really think it's important. Like if something needs to be genuinely done within a certain time period, obviously if it's a priority, there's some urgency to it. Of course, like I'm willing to
Hmm.
put in that time. And I guess it kind of depends on the situation. Like if this is a one isolated situation, maybe I would do it, but then also note, okay, this is unexpected. Try to avoid it from being a recurring thing, that if somebody is
Hmm.
not managing the delegation or distribution of work because of them, then
Hmm.
I would want to try to understand that, because I wouldn't want it to be like every Friday at the last minute
Yeah.
to have to be put in that position. Now, if it's a
Yeah.
one exceptional case, that's fine, right? So it depends on what the work urgency was at that time. But I think generally I would, or I might say, like, look, I have commitments that evening, and depending on the priority, could it wait till
Yeah.
Monday? If
Yeah.
not, then sure, I can,
Hmm.
try to work things around on the weekend if that's possible.
It's good advice. That is good advice. I love that because I feel like almost like you picked up on this idea of like priority. And I struggle with this all the time. It's like someone asks you to do something. Again, this is me. I'm this people pleaser. I'm like, okay, yes, I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll do it. Without even actually contextualizing, like maybe that is the point. Like you can ask the question, like, how much of a priority is this? How urgent is this? As
Yeah.
opposed to just maybe, so that's actually really, really useful advice. This idea of understanding the
Yeah.
priority.
And then on the flip side too, like for myself, I think with life experiences that I've learned to know what are personal priorities that are definitely absolutely no, I'm not going to break whatever personal commitment. Like I had, my parents were ill at certain points in my
Yeah.
life. So if there was a health related
Yeah.
commitment where I had to be with them, it'd be absolutely no. I'd
Mhm.
explain that. Hopefully they would understand, but that would be a no negotiation situation. Whereas if it's dinner with friends,
Friends. Yeah. No,
but
yeah, that's a good point. It's almost like balancing the priorities within your own life against those of work.
and it's also the way that someone is asking you to take this on. If they're just assuming you want to do it, like people should know better. If it's a Friday, 5 o'clock, and then they put something urgent on your desk, they shouldn't be just like, this has to be done. They need to
Mm.
at least be respectful in the way, acknowledge your
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
your,
Yeah. Yeah.
your
Absolutely. That
week.
goes such a long way. Such a
Yeah.
long way.
Mhm.
Okay. And then how about, do you have any tips for establishing boundaries in your personal life with family, friends?
Yeah, and I think this is something that I've had to really learn over time, because for me, just being an only child, and for me, I don't have a lot of, close extended family either. So my
Mm.
friends are really the people that I like count on
Yeah.
and, hold very, very dearly to me. So even within a friendship context, sometimes it's hard to say no to things. And I think
Mm.
what I've learned over time is just really, really being able to express your needs as well, and just openly, even if it's like, I'm not feeling well, right? Or I'm just
Mhm.
having, like I'm just super tired from the day, or I'm just, in a bad mood and I really don't want to. And maybe they'll convince me otherwise to do something, but it's just being open and, just communicating what you need as well. And also just appreciating others. There's certain things that obviously you don't want to miss, like a wedding or an important event like that, but there's always reasons to not be part of things. But as long as you are able to explain. And then what I often do too sometimes is, if I know there might not be a chance that I can do something 100%, then like I'm already
Mhm.
planting the seed. My intention is to, but I may not
Yeah.
be able to. So let me reconfirm closer to the date, because then it gives you that wiggle room to be able to
Yeah.
kind of decline. If I'm committing to something, I genuinely want to act on it,
Mm.
right? And follow through
Mhm.
with it. So it's hard for me to just commit to something and not follow through with it. So if there is any doubt, then I definitely frame it that way at the outset, to just kind of, I
Yeah.
suppose, manage expectations, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's good. Good tips, Trang. Top tips with Trang. TTT.
Triple T.
Okay, so we're moving on to the final portion of this podcast, and it's called the Envisionnaire Questionnaire, which has become, yes, it's an exciting feature of the podcast where we ask our guest 3 questions that is meant to reflect the past, the present, and the future. The first question I have.
I'm scared now.
No, it's good. The first one. If you could offer your 15-year-old self any advice, what would it be?
Ooh, I mean, there's probably, I guess, maybe take a little bit more risks. Just be a bit more explorative and really new types of experiences.
I love that.
I think that's one thing I would probably, because, you look back and you think you've done it all, but you really haven't. So, I wish I could have done a bit more, especially when I was a bit younger too, because I think at 15, I was slowly starting to grow more independence and confidence, but probably held back on some things that I probably wanted to do. But I think it could have been just because I didn't know what was entirely out there, right? It was just being comfortable with what I knew.
Yeah. Maybe like try new things. Second question. This is based on the present. So based on where you are in your life today, if you could seek advice from anyone, alive or dead, who would it be?
An individual person.
I guess we're people. I've never really. Who are the people?
The people? I can choose more than one, or just.
Sure. I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, ideally, if there's one person, but if you need to ask people, that's totally cool too.
That's a tough one. I mean, if I could get the advice of anyone. I don't know why this comes to mind. But I would really be interested in meeting Warren Buffett for advice.
Wow. Financial or personal?
For financial advice and just learning more about him, because I feel like, he kind of, advanced in his life in a very confident way and probably unconventional way. And, he's a very successful man, and he's known as a very like one of the biggest philanthropists. So I'd be interested in knowing and learning from him, because from what I've heard, it's interesting in that way. So
oh, yeah.
I don't know why has just come to my mind right now. So.
I love that though. I think that's great. I mean, it's a great choice. That's really cool. And now I know this about you, and I'm like, okay.
Tomorrow might be somebody else. I've always wanted to I've heard about these very spiritual monks. They've reached a certain level of spirituality where they can not eat, create even their own energy out of their own physical body. Yeah. And I find that very fascinating. So I would be interested, but that's more just in terms of just understanding that, because that's an area where I would still like to grow a lot in terms of my spiritual journey. So yeah.
I love that too. Okay. So that was your people, 2 different individuals. I love that though. I think that's so cool. Maybe we should try and do that, like a retreat to like a monastery.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay, well, this segues into the third question and the final question, which is future looking. So what would you say is one goal that you would like to achieve either in the next year or in the next 5 years? Or both?
There's this one thing that I just always want to do is be able to, I just really want to live in a warm place. So, on a beachfront, warm place, I don't know, that is just where I am truly the happy. So if I am anywhere closer to that in the next 5 years or within that, I hope I'm making progress towards that, because I'd love to be able to, in longer term years, be able to end up somewhere warm. So that's the goal right now for me.
So we'll have our Melrose place.
Yeah.
In Hawaii, for those listeners that are. That's always been a goal of Trang and I to talk about.
That's the retirement plan.
Yeah, that we'll just have like a building that'll be like Melrose Place, and we'll all just live there.
You have your own independent spaces, so when you need that, boundary, but communal living is great as well, and we can just meet
for dinner. Yeah. No, I think that'd be good. I actually could see that happening. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being a part of the Envisionnaire podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
And lots of love. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. Love you.
Thanks everyone for listening to the Envisionnaire podcast. You are now officially an Envisionnaire, so welcome to the club. Make sure that you like and subscribe to this podcast so that you stay up to date on all of our new episodes. And remember, every day offers us a new opportunity to start envisioning and living our best lives.